Now, I'm going to ask you a question, and as you can see, I don't get too excited about standing behind the pulpit because it feels too far away and it feels like we can't have a conversation. So I'm going to put a mission statement of a company up on the screen, and I want you to tell me if you recognize which company might have had this mission statement: to make photography accessible to everyone. Anyone like to take a guess? Which company do you think might have had this mission statement: to make photography accessible to everyone? Kodak. Kodak. Now that's a trick question, because if you knew the answer to that, it shows your age. Right? Because if you asked a different age group if they'd ever heard of Kodak, they'd never heard of Kodak. They don't know what Kodak is. Right? And if you want to explain to young people or to kids what Kodak is, you'll have to go to a museum, right? And show them. Anybody even heard of film? Does anybody even know what film is? Yeah. I actually looked up buying some film a couple of weeks ago, and it's really expensive. It's like a rare, it's almost like an antique thing, you know? It's not one of those things you just pick up from the news agency or the corner shop. Kodak's mission, it existed to make photography accessible to everyone. And through the 60s, 70s, 80s, it was the dominant photographic player in the world. It had more than a third of the market for cameras and for film, which is why back in the day, for those of us that still remember, there used to be, you didn't take a photo, you took a what? Anyone remember? A Kodak or a Kodak moment. You know, it was that common and that prevalent and that dominant in the industry. Kodak was absolutely massive. They were one of the largest companies in the world that just dominated in this space. In 1974-75, a young engineer joined Kodak by the name of Steve Sasson. And in his spare time, Steve would go to the engineering lab and he'd play with, you know, the trinkets and the bits and pieces that were left over from other camera projects, and he came up with this incredible, beautiful contraption. It's just the kind of thing that would really go well with your handbag or your shoes, and, you know, you'd love to be able to take this wherever you go, right? It just the aesthetic, absolutely beautiful. So he took it to Kodak management, and he says, "Look what I've invented. This is absolutely incredible. It's the best thing since sliced bread." And they take a look at it, and, you know, he's a young guy. He's like 23, 24, and they don't want to burst his bubble. And they say, "Oh, okay, Steve, that looks interesting. What does it do?" And he says, "It takes photos." I'm like, "You're a little bit late to that party, Steve. I mean, we've been doing cameras for a while, and the ones we have look a little bit better than that." He says, "Yeah, but this takes," what kind of photos? This takes digital photos. This camera doesn't need film. And they're like, "Okay, Steve, show us what it does." So he shows them the first photo without film. They were not very impressed. That's about 1,000 pixels by 1,000 pixels, something like that. About 100 by 100, very small. They were not impressed. They had a good chuckle. And Steve said, "This is just the beginning. If we patent this, we are going to revolutionize the film industry, because our mission is to make photography accessible to everyone." And can you imagine if film doesn't hinder people from taking photos? That would be incredible. And Kodak executives looked at it and they said, "Okay, we see the potential here." So they put a patent on the digital camera, and they locked the patent in the safe for the next 19 years. Why do you think they refused to develop the digital camera when they were the first to market? They had it. They could have created a monopoly. For 19 years until their patent expired, it could have been Kodak all the way doing digital camera. Why do you think they were so afraid of advancing the digital camera? They don't want change. Have you ever bought a printer? Printers are so cheap. And you're like, "I bought this amazing printer for $50. And then you go to buy ink, and the ink is like $400, right? That's how Kodak was making money. They were making money from film. And they said, if we don't do film, if we don't sell film because our own product doesn't need film, we're going to lose money. So instead of thinking about their mission to make photography accessible to everyone, they got greedy and they started thinking about money instead of mission. 19 years later, when the patent expired, Fuji, Nikon, Canon, Sony, Pentax, you've heard of them. As soon as the patent expired, they all developed digital cameras. Within a few years, Kodak became something of museums. And those other companies have made money from digital cameras, even without film, and Kodak could have been it. But they just lost sight of their mission. Now, you and I, we as Christians, are also invited to join in a mission. And it's found in Matthew chapter 28, verse 19 and 20. Now, many of you may know this one off by heart. It's called the Great Commission. Now, I always enjoy when sometimes as churches and as Christians, we get little groups and committees and we say, what is our mission? Can you imagine working for Tesla? Anyone heard of Tesla? You work for Tesla, you work for Elon Musk, and you get to work and you say, hey, we need a little committee to figure out why Tesla exists. I think Tesla is here to make the best toasters in the world. Do you think Elon Musk would be impressed? Who sets the direction for Tesla? Who sets the direction for Tesla? Elon Musk, right? It's his company. He gets to set his mission. The workers don't turn up to work and say, no, we don't want to make electric cars. We think we might get into pot plants, right? It just doesn't make sense. And when it comes to followers of Jesus, we don't get to choose our mission. We don't set it, right? If we choose to follow Jesus, who sets our mission? It comes from him, right? Now, the mission is not prescriptive. It's not you have to do this or else. It's not a prescription, it's a subscription. What's the difference between a prescription and a subscription? A prescription is something you have to do because someone tells you so. A subscription is something we choose. How many of you have? No, I was going to ask a Netflix subscription. Nobody here would have a Netflix subscription. You might have an Apple Music subscription or a Spotify subscription. You've chosen to opt in, and the disciples of Jesus chose to opt in. Not because they were afraid of God, but because they'd experienced Jesus. That experienced healing, that experienced miracles, that experienced forgiveness, that experienced love and compassion. And because of that, Jesus says, if you've experienced and enjoyed everything I've got and I've given you, then my invitation is join me and share this. Make more disciples. That's what the Great Commission is. Go into all the world. Make disciples, baptize them, teach them everything I've commanded. And sometimes the word disciple can be a little bit confusing because that's not the kind of word we use every day. But if Jesus was talking today, he would say make apprentices. Because that's all it is. It's an apprentice. It's like when you become a carpenter, when you become a doctor, when you become whatever industry or profession, you're an intern or you're an apprentice. And that's all Jesus was saying. Make more people that become like you and become like me. Now, for us as a Seventh-day Adventist church, we look at that mission and we also appreciate the prophetic insights of Daniel and Revelation. And you'd be very familiar with this, or many of you would be familiar with this. In Revelation chapter 14, it says, it gives us 3 messages for the times we are living in. So as Adventists, we say the gospel commission is what we do all day, every day, but we do it through the lens or through the times that we live in that the 3 angels' messages help us understand right at the end of time. Let's go make disciples. Remind them Jesus is coming soon. Remind them that he's the creator. Remind them that as followers of Jesus, we need to stay away from corruption, from Babylon, from things that create harm. That's who we are. Does that make sense? We're Seventh-day Adventist Christians who are there to make disciples, and we do that in the context of the incredible times we live in. How do we fulfill this mission most effectively? How do we do this with greater power, greater energy, and more effectiveness? We're going to come to Scripture in a minute, but before we do, we're going to go to another lesson book, to Nature's lesson book. We're going to learn something from the body that gives us some insights into how we can be most effective in our mission. The human body is composed of, depending on how tall, how big, how old you are, of between 50 to 100 billion cells. That's all. Not too many, right? Now, some of you may remember, and I do, when I went to school, they used to talk about the simple cell. Anybody remember the simple cell? Yeah. Did you know they don't call it the simple cell anymore? Do you know why they don't call it the simple cell anymore? Because what have they discovered? It's very complex. They don't call it the simple cell, they call it the complex cell. So we're going to look at the complex cell And we're going to use a metaphor, an analogy that really brings the cell to life. So you've got the human cell, 50 to 100 billion of these in each of our bodies, and we're going to call the cell something that describes what it does better. We're going to call the cell a factory, right? So the cell is literally like a factory. It's got its own power plant, it's got its own workers. If you were to dive into a simple, now we know it's complex cell, you will find, again, depending on the type of cell, up to 100 trillion molecules and anywhere between, 10 to 100 billion workers. Did you know cells have workers? They've got engineers. They've got writers. They've got scientists. They've got machinists. They've got forklift operators. They've got assembly line supervisors. Each human cell has, they used to call them machines, but now they're looking at it and they're like, these aren't just machines. It's almost like they are individual beings to the tune of hundreds of billions of these in each human cell that run around, that work together, that interact. If you were to take a cell, a single cell from the liver, and you were to insert it into the kidney, that cell, the workers inside the cell have the capacity to read its environment, to know that it's moved from the kidney to the liver, and to now change how it operates to behave like a liver cell. It's incredible, right? The workers in cells are called proteins and enzymes. They're the most basic one. A protein is just a general worker, and an enzyme is a specialist. You might go to a factory, and you might find some people who are just moving boxes around, but you might find some supervisors, you might find some engineers, and the enzymes are literally like engineers that do incredibly complex things to the tunes of hundreds of millions of activities every single second. So that's the factory, the cell. Now, as you go into this factory, anybody here ever worked in a warehouse or been to a warehouse, a factory? Yeah, you may have. I used to work as a tradesman working for my father and, would go on site, you'd go past the gate and there was a big sign that usually said, all visitors must do what? Report to where? They'd have to report to the office. You'd have to go to the office. You'd have to sign in and get your induction. So you've got the factory and then you've got the nucleus. So the nucleus is like the office. That's the headquarters of the complex cell. As you walk into the office, you're going to find a couple of things. You're going to find a desk. Now we have computers, but back in the day before computers, you'd find a shelf with probably some books, some induction or instruction manuals. And what you'll find in the cell is you'll find the genome. Anybody heard of the genome? You've heard of the genome? Yeah. Imagine the genome in a factory, in the office, on the shelf, is essentially a book. And this is the instruction manual or book for this entire cell. That's all it is. That's what it does. The genome is our instruction manual for the cell that reproduces, that creates life. Now, if you were to open this book, this genome, you'd find that it has 46 chapters. And we call these chapters chromosomes. You heard of chromosomes? Yeah, there's 46 of them. But there's something really interesting as you read this book. The first 23 chapters, you read chapter 1 through to 23, then you get to chapter 24, and chapter 24 is really, familiar, because chapter 24 matches chapter 1, and chapter 25 matches chapter 22, and then you realize that the first 23 chapters are almost identical to the last 23 chapters. That's interesting. Why is that the case? Do you have some doctors, some scientists here, some people that remember high school biology? We've got 2 contributors to this book. We've got 23 chapters that come from mum's side and 23 chapters that come from dad's side. And now the workers, the proteins, the enzymes, and all the other bits and pieces in the cells, as they read this instruction manual, they say, okay, now it's time to create another being. And we've got 2 wonderful sets of instructions. And we're going to take the best of each from each, right? The nose, we think the nose, yeah, mum's got the nose there. Let's do mum's nose for this new being. So they read these chromosomes and they do mum's nose and dad's ears and so on, and that's how you get another human being. Each book, the genome, has 46 chapters, and each chapter has what we call genes. Have you ever heard of genes before? About 25,000 genes. Call these paragraphs. So you might have a chapter, let's say, now I'm I'm making this up because it's a lot more complex than that. But let's say you have chapter 4 is on the head, right? And as you start reading that chapter on the head, you've got paragraphs in there that describe the nose, the ears, the eyes, the jaw, your hairline, all those sorts of things. You with me so far? That's the paragraphs that we have. And then the paragraphs get broken down into DNA. Anyone heard of DNA before? Yeah? Does anyone know what it stands for? Deoxy something or other, right? Yep, we'll go with that. What is DNA? DNA is basically the sentences of human code. In this book that we're reading, in this genome book, you've got sentences. So you might have the eye, but then there's a sentence on eye color, or there's a sentence on eye shape. And then you've got those broken down into words. Each word has 3 syllables that are made up of 6 individual letters. Now, there are about 6 billion letters, just about 6. If you were to take those and put those into a book, and then you were to look at how many books it would take, you and I have enough instruction in each DNA cell of about 16,000 books. So to recreate you, someone would literally have to type about 16,000 books that would describe who you are, what you're like, height, shape, pretty much every physical detail that there is about you. Isn't that incredible? Absolutely incredible. Now, our scientists are starting to figure this out. In the 60s, in the 70s, they're reading DNA. And it's starting to make more sense. And they're starting to decipher it and interpret it and understand it. And every now and again, they come across code or DNA or sentences in DNA that doesn't make a lot of sense. Nonsense code, gibberish. And initially they say, oh, well, whatever's happening here is, it's probably an artifact of evolution. You know how we evolved from nothing into something? It's probably an artifact of evolution, and it's not necessary, it's not helpful, it's just old code that we can't use, or that the proteins, the workers, the machines in our body can't use. That's what they thought for a long time. Until the 1970s, when the guy in Japan by the name of Susumu Tokugawa started looking at it with advanced technology and realized that there's a lot more to nonsense code than artifacts of evolution that are useless. You can see there a picture of one of these machines, one of these creatures that's opening, reading code, reading the manual, and knowing how to build new cells. Susumu discovered how human cells interact with this. What do you think this might be? A guess? A virus, right? What does a virus do? Now, we're going to use our factory analogy, okay? So a virus is an external body that comes from outside. It's not part of how we're created. It's not part of our bodies. So a virus is like a bully. Yeah, bullies at school? Yeah? No bullies at your school. Maybe if you're homeschooled, there are no bullies. A virus is like a bully that comes into the factory, looks around and says, this is a great place to eat somebody else's lunch. A virus can't replicate itself, and it's really lazy. It doesn't do anything for itself. It just uses and abuses cells out there. So it comes into the cell, and it starts eating everybody else's lunch. The lunch of the proteins and the enzymes. And what happens to the proteins and the enzymes, the workers, when somebody else is eating their lunch? What happens to them? They starve. Right? They literally starve. And if they starve, what happens to the cell ultimately? It dies. But the virus is both selfish and clever, and it says, I don't want to die, because if I eat everybody's lunch and they die, then what happens to me? So before the enzymes and the proteins die, the virus bullies them into replicating itself. It makes more copies of it. So now there was one bully in the factory. Then you have 2 and 4 and 8 and exponentially, which means that the cell dies even quicker. And as soon as the cell dies, viruses are too lazy to fend for themselves. They're not going to produce anything. They're not going to make their own lunch. They're not going to help out in any way. So what will the virus do when this cell has died? It moves on to where? To the next cell, and the next cell, and the next cell, until eventually the virus has eaten everybody's lunch, replicated itself significantly where it permeates the living organism, and the living organism dies. And what happens to the virus when the body dies? If it can't go anywhere else, the virus dies. Can you imagine that? It's self-destructive. It doesn't make sense. That's just what viruses do. So Susumu Tonegawa in the 1970s, and he got a Nobel Prize for this in 1987. In the 1970s, he found something, I'm not going to go into the full details, but essentially he discovered that when a virus comes, did you know that our cells have phone mechanisms that are much more advanced than anything that we have in terms of Wi-Fi and mobile reception? So as soon as the virus comes into the cell supervisor rings security. Who's security in the human body? The white blood cells. So the supervisor rings security and say, you got to come save us, right? And so the white blood cells, they're marching, they've got an army, and they get into there, and they look at the virus and they say, what weapons can we use to defeat this virus? We're not sure what the best tool is. But what the body does through this nonsense code that we talked about earlier, these DNA bits and pieces that mean nothing, those nonsense codes are actually tools and weapons that the body stores. So the body can't create an infinite amount of defensive weapons, but it creates literally billions and hundreds of billions. And what security does is it goes to this nonsense code. It's like as if it's an armory with tools. Hey, I'm going to try a bazooka, I'm going to try a machine gun, I'm going to try a boomerang, I'm going to try a spear, I'm going to try a sword, and all of that nonsense code were just different types of weapons. And so the white blood cells try every weapon in the armory, and if a weapon works, and this weapon defeats the virus, then the white blood cells go back into human DNA and say, okay, we took a photo of this virus, this is what he looks like. Let's store it back in DNA. So it rewrites code into this book of DNA, and it says, okay, when you see this COVID virus, or this flu, or when you see whatever virus it is, here's what it looks like, and here is the exact weapon that worked. So next time you encounter that virus, and they call security, you don't have a long, drawn-out battle. It doesn't take days and weeks and months for the body to heal because it knows exactly what tool to use. It has memory, and it's found a way to make this work. For this to happen, and it's happening right now in your body, it's happening right now to the tune of hundreds of millions of times every second. Our cells are constantly interacting. We don't even feel it. When the body doesn't know exactly which tool to use and it takes a while, how do we feel? When the body's figuring out how to fight the virus, how do we feel? We feel pretty crook because what our body does is it diverts energy and resources and tools from the rest of our body to the place where the virus is, which is why when you have a viral infection, what's the best thing to do? To rest, because it allows your body to focus most of its energy on that. Often, you also get inflammation or a fever, because that's where there is a lot of, can you imagine a war without smoke and fire? It's literally a war at a molecular level, and the intensity creates heat, and sometimes the body uses heat to try to destroy the virus. It's just incredible. So every single waking moment, there are literally hundreds of billions of activities with hundreds of billions of workers in each single cell constantly working to keep you and I alive. And if one of those workers decides to take a day off, what happens to you and I? Well, it's the last day that we had. Each and every single one is absolutely indispensable. There is no hierarchy. You can't say, well, this protein is better than that enzyme, and yeah, we could do without a few of these proteins because we've got the enzymes to back. Each one is indispensable. It's essential. It's so complex that Richard Dawkins, now again, Don't put your hand up because it shows your age and it shows my age. I remember Richard Dawkins. Younger people today have no idea who Richard Dawkins is because he's not around that much anymore. But back in the 2000s, he was the most prominent evolutionary scientist. He wrote The God Delusion, The Selfish Gene. He even had his picture on London buses saying, "There is no God," probably, right? And this is what he had to say about the complexity of life, because he is a molecular biologist. He says, if you look at the details of molecular biology, which is what we talked about, you might find a signature of some sort of designer. He's saying it is so complex, it is so advanced, there are so many things happening in a single cell that it is impossible for this to have just come up by chance. He says that designer could very well be a higher intelligence from elsewhere in the universe. Did you catch that? Richard Dawkins is saying, yeah, life didn't evolve on Earth because it's too complex. It is impossible for that to have happened. So where did life come from, according to Richard Dawkins? A different being somewhere else in the universe. Now, he just couldn't bring himself to say that, but what he's actually saying is it was aliens. One of the smartest men on Earth is saying life on Earth came from aliens. Now, you and I, we don't call God an alien because he's not alien to us, he's known to us. But yeah, I agree with Richard Dawkins. That designer could be a higher intelligence from elsewhere in the universe. Would that be fair? Yeah. We talked about DNA. Francis Collins, the scientist, one of the world's leading scientists who unraveled DNA, the first to lead the project that read the entire human DNA, he's an active Christian. Because as he looks at it, he says, how can you believe that somebody wrote this book with 6 billion letters, 16,000 books worth of information, and that just came from absolutely nothing? There must have been somebody that designed this. Let's go to 1 Corinthians chapter 12. And thank you, Tony, for reading this. We're not going to read the whole passage. 1 Corinthians chapter 12. And we're going to look at our mission, who we are, and how God has created us to thrive and to work together in fulfilling the mission that we've subscribed to. 1 Corinthians chapter 12. And we're going to read a few verses from there. Now, it says, there are different kinds of gifts, this is verse 4, but the same Spirit distributes them. There are different kinds of service, but the same Lord. There are different kinds of working, but in all of them and in everyone, it is the same God at work. Here Paul is talking about the body of Christ, about his church. And it says that who gives gifts to the church? The Spirit does. It's not a choice. You don't fill in a survey and you don't order it online. You don't look in the mirror and say, oh, I want this gift or I want that gift. You don't do rock, paper, scissors and decide who gets what gift. God chooses to do something. He gives different gifts. And why does he do that? Verse 7. Now to each one the manifestation of the Spirit is given for the common good. God gives how many people in his family? How many people in his body does he give gifts to? I'm not making this up. He says it, right? You don't have to look for it. He says, I'm giving everybody something. Ultimately, for what purpose? For the common good. It lists here a number of these, not all of them, because as you read through the New Testament, you'll find different gifts listed in different places. Let's go to verse 11. All these, the different gifts we've just discussed, all these are the work of one and the same Spirit, and he distributes them to each one just as he determines. You catch up? God is the one that gives different gifts, and he chooses who gets what, and he does it to build up the church and to build up the church's effectiveness and mission to seek and to save the lost. Verse 12, just as a body, though one has many parts, but all its many parts form one body, so it is with Christ. Even so, verse 13, for we are all baptized by one Spirit, so as to form one body, whether Jews or Gentiles, slave or free, and we are all given the one Spirit to drink. Even so, the body is not made up of one part, but of many. Who is the head of this body? Not the pastor? Not the pastor? Maybe not the pastor, but definitely the conference president. Right? And maybe we have to go high, maybe the union or division or GC president, the head of this body. No? The head of the body is Christ. Just one head, not two heads, not three heads. There are no Siamese twins here, co-joined at the hip, where Jesus and I are the head together. It's Jesus is the head, and he gives intentionally via the Spirit different gifts to different people so that all work together. The next part then, I encourage you to read this. We won't read through it now, but it's talking about the body, and it says, can basically the foot say, I don't want to operate today? Or can the eye say, I want to be an ear? It just doesn't make sense for different parts of the body to want to be something different. And he goes on to say some of the parts of the body we think about the least are the ones that actually provide the greatest service. You know, you don't wake up every morning and think, oh, my big toe feels really good. I'm glad I have a big toe. Really grateful to God for my big toe. Like, it just doesn't happen, right? But then if you wake up in the middle of the night and the light's off and you want to go to the bathroom or to get a drink of water and you stub your toe in the bed frame, I'm sure it's never happened to any of you, all of a sudden you're really grateful for your big toe, right? Because you remember that it's there and it actually provides incredible balance and stability and mobility. All you have to do is lose it to realize, hey, there's a reason why the big toe is here. Just as in the cell, every single protein and enzyme and the other trillions of bits and pieces that are in there are necessary, so too in the body, each part of us is absolutely essential and necessary. We're going to go to look at a group of gifts that God gives. Let's go to Ephesians chapter 4. Ephesians chapter 4. And we're going to read verse 11 to 16. Different gifts. Gifts are not superior. They're not better. Some are not more important than others, just as the body parts aren't more or less important than others. And here's another set of gifts that we talk about that has a specific function, but not more important, not better. Essential, yes, but not superior. So Christ himself, Ephesians chapter 4, verse 11. So Christ himself gave the apostles, the prophets, the evangelists, the pastors, and teachers. God has given some gifts in the church, and it lists these gifts. The apostles, evangelists, pastors, prophets, teachers. Not better, not superior. These aren't gifts that these individuals choose, the same way God gives you and I different gifts as his choice, and he gives us gifts because he knows us. He created us. It says that he knows how many hairs we have. And for some of us, that's a lot, and for some of us, it's easier to count. But regardless, he knows us to that level of detail. And the gifts he gives us are those that match us and match our environment and match our context. I grew up in Western Sydney. Anyone know where Western Sydney is? Western Sydney, Blacktown, around there. And I always looked at the surfy dudes. You know what a surfy dude is? The surfers, you know, they got the long blonde hair, they're just a bit too cool for school, and, you know, a few words, and everyone wants to be, you know, a guy on a surfboard. And so even though we lived in Western Sydney, an hour and a half from the beach, convinced my dad to buy me a surfboard. Anyone ever tried surfing? Surfing is really hard. I wasn't a surfie, I was a nerd. I like books, I like computers. I remember back in the 90s, and this might not mean much to some of you, but DVD burners. Anyone know what a DVD burner is? Back in the day? Yeah, I had my own DVD burner, you know, and I used to, I shouldn't have done it, but used to burn games and sell them to the surfies, right, you know, because they didn't know how to run a DVD burner. You know, and I always wanted to be something different growing up, and buying a surfboard does not make you a surfie, and it doesn't grow your hair long and blonde, and it doesn't make you cool and suave. It still leaves you as a nerd. I was a nerd. I read books, you know, I enjoyed books. I enjoyed computers and technology and that sort of thing. And then I realized later on as I grew up that there's a reason why God makes us unique, right? I don't know if you're a nerd or a surfie or somewhere in between, but I've tried talking to surfies, and I really struggle. right? How you doing, bro? I'm cool, man. What's happening? Not much. What's today like? Surf's up. I don't know how to relate to them. I don't know what to say to get through. Put a nerd next to me and we can chat for hours, right? So God created me to be able to connect with people like me, right? And He created surfies to connect with people like surfies. And that's okay because God gifts and creates and makes us unique in different ways. And instead of wanting to be a surfie, just say, wow, God was so clever. He made me to connect with people that nobody else can. Isn't that incredible? And here it talks about a different group of people, different gifts. Pastors, evangelists, teachers, prophets. And what is their job? He says their role, they've been created uniquely to equip His people for works of service so that the body of Christ may be built up. What does God call pastors, apostles, evangelists, prophets, teachers to do? To equip, to train His church so that the body of Christ may be built up until we all reach unity in the faith and in the knowledge of the Son of God and become mature, attaining to the whole measure of the fullness of Christ. Then we will no longer be infants tossed back and forth by the waves and blown here and there by every wind of teaching and by the cunning and craftiness of people in the deceitful scheming. The role of this group of gifts is to build up others, to train, to equip others to maturity. What does it mean to raise a child to maturity? How many of you have a really normal, healthy child or grandchild? They're in their 20s, and every morning you brush their hair, and you put toothpaste on their toothbrush, and you say to your 23-year-old, don't forget to brush your teeth. And they get downstairs, and you say, hey, you're in pajamas, let's go back upstairs, and let's put your clothes on, and they're ready to get out of the house, and you say, let me tie your shoelaces. How many of you do that for a normal, healthy 24-year-old? Why not? It's absurd. Because our job as parents is to do what with our children? To bring them to maturity so that they can contribute to their family, to their community, to the world around them in their own right. And if you're still doing that for a 25-year-old, we need to have a chat, right? It's not okay. It's not normal. And what it says is that the role of the pastors, evangelists, prophets, teachers, apostles is to mature other Christians, to not be tossed and turned, to not go astray, to be whole, complete, and ready to live and lead and serve in their own right. Because at some point in time, a child should mature enough where they don't need a parent. It doesn't mean they don't want to spend time with a parent, true? But they don't need a parent. If you're 25, if your 30-year-old is calling you 23 times a day on basic life advice, you'd be really concerned if they still need you. Wonderful to be loved, but they should advance beyond being needed. Verse 15. Instead, speaking the truth in love, we will grow to become in every respect the mature body of Him who is the head, that is, Christ. From Him the whole body joined and held together by every supporting ligament grows and builds itself up in love as each part does its work. Did you catch that? That's really profound. God gives some the gifts of building the church so that the church is mature, so that the church can then build and do and serve and carry out its function on its own out of maturity. Is that clear? Why would the church do this? I love what Ellen White has to say. She says, those who follow Jesus, and remember, Jesus doesn't force us to follow Him. It was always an open invitation. Come and follow me. And when people chose to reject Him, He loved them and prayed for them anyway, but didn't coerce them. Those who have been touched, inspired, moved, transformed by Jesus, those who follow Jesus will be laborers together with God. It is the love of Christ, not guilt, not shame, not a sense of duty, not because the pastor said so, not because my parents said so. It is the love of Christ which has been the incentive of every true missionary worker in cities, in towns, in the highways and the byways of the world. When we encounter Jesus, it transforms our lives. Now, some of us have grown up in the church. I've grown up in the church. And sometimes when we grow up in the church, we take for granted. And we look at people out there and we think, oh, they're so happy. without Jesus? That's because we probably haven't spent a lot of time with people out there. As a pastor, I've spent time with people out there. People are fantastic at putting a facade on. But the world is in a dark, depressed, discouraged, anxious place. People don't have hope. It doesn't matter how good they look at work and how happy they look on social media, and it doesn't matter all the selfies they post. Without Jesus, people are empty. If you listen to some of the world's top podcasters, Stephen Bartlett, Chris Williamson, Joe Rogan, these are some of the most famous celebrity podcasters in the world. They are rich, they are famous, they are celebrities, and over the last 2-3 years, every single one of them are saying, life is meaningless. Life is a bit empty. We've got it all, and we don't know what now. What's it all for? And they're starting to explore faith. They're starting to talk about God because we think that if we have the things of this world, it brings satisfaction. It doesn't. When we encounter Jesus, it's the love of Jesus that incentivizes us because we've experienced the forgiveness, the redemption, the hope, the transformation, the purpose to live, and that compels us to say, hey, I want to be involved in making apprentices, in helping others find the peace and the joy that I have. That's the role, that's the call, that's the invitation of every single one of us. But some, the pastors, apostles, evangelists, prophets, teachers, their job is to help grow us. And not grow us forever, but grow us to a point of maturity. And what happens when we're mature? Guess what? There should be a point in time when we don't need what? Where we don't need mum and dad. Where we don't need the pastor, apostle, evangelist, prophet, teacher. Why? Because we are mature, right? We've grown. We've learned how to read the Bible for ourselves. We've learned how to pray. We've learned how to care for each other. We've learned how to love for each other. So then what value do the apostles, pastors, teachers, evangelists, prophets have? What are they good for once they've matured us? Well, I'm glad you asked. Instead of keeping the ministers at work for the churches that already know the truth, do we know the truth here at Arimba? I think there are a lot of mature Christians here. And I know some of you, I've known some of you for many years, some of you I've known more recently, and there's an incredible depth of maturity and faith. You know who you are, you know what you believe, and you know why. Instead of keeping the ministers at work for the churches that already know the truth, let the members of the church, that's you and me, say to these laborers, go work for souls that are perishing in darkness. We ourselves will carry forward the service of the church. We will keep up the meetings, and by abiding in Christ, we'll maintain spiritual life. We will work for souls that are about us, and we will send our prayers and our gifts to sustain the laborers in more needy and destitute fields. Did you catch that? When a parent has finished raising this child, and a parent has a few children, their job is to then raise the next child and the next child. And historically, in the New Testament and in the early Adventist church, the pastors didn't stay at a local church. The evangelists, the prophets, the teachers, you know what they did? They came somewhere. They brought light to a new place. They would share the gospel. I mean, look at Paul. They would share the gospel. They would grow and mature those that had responded to the gospel of Jesus. And what would they do then? They'd move on to the next person, to the next group, to the next town, to the next field that needed the gospel. The Seventh-day Adventist Church was one of the fastest growing churches in the 18 and 1900s, and other Christians looked at it and said, why are they growing so fast? And you know what the conclusion was? The Baptists actually wrote an article on the Adventists in the late 1800s, and there's a difference between them and us. Why they're growing and we're not is because they don't hijack pastors. Their pastors are apostles. Their pastors are prophets, evangelists, teachers. Their pastors come, build up a church, bring it to maturity, and then they go to the next town. We, on the other hand, we hijack that particular gift and we use it for ourselves. We use the tithes and offerings to look after ourselves. But tithes were to do what? What does it say? We will send our prayers and our gifts to sustain the laborers in more needy and destitute fields. Around 1878, one of the biggest Adventist churches in the world back then, and there were only about 5,000-6,000 Adventists in the world back then, but Battle Creek Church had about 1,000 members attending regularly. And Battle Creek Church looked across the road at a Baptist church and said they have their own pastor. And if they have their own pastor, you know what we think we should have? We should have our own pastor. And Ellen White and the brethren and the sisters said no, because we are a missionary movement. We're here to share the gospel. We're not here to be babysat. You don't need one. Do you remember the story in Samuel when the Israelites looked at the other nations and what did they want? We want a king. We want to be like everybody else. And so in 1878, despite protests from Ellen White and others, guess what? Battle Creek got its own pastor. And that was the largest church. Guess what the second largest church a couple of cities away said? If Battle Creek gets their own, guess what? We want one too. Today in the world, mission is advancing furthest where a pastor might have 40 to 50 churches. Did you know that? Because the pastor has a clear role. The evangelist has a clear role. And you and I are also gifted and called in unique and special ways. Not better, not worse. Every gift has privileges and every gift has challenges. Some people say, well, the pastors have it easy. Well, they have different burdens to carry, different roles. And some pastors look at members and say, the members have it easy. Well, members have different burdens to carry. We're all called and gifted differently and unique. When we all spend time in prayer with Jesus and say, what have you called me to do? And we fill the purpose and the gift that God has given us, the body grows. The body is strengthened. And it grows here, and it grows next door, and next town, and next city, and next place. What can you and I do? I love this statement. It says, Christ's method alone will give true success in reaching the people. This is the call that you and I have. The Savior mingled with men as one who desired their good. We have the privilege and the opportunity to mingle with others. It's not rocket science. It really isn't. Mingle. What does it mean to mingle? Let's break this down. What does it mean to mingle with others? To spend time with them. That's it. Just to be with other people. Now, what kind of people am I going to spend time with? Well, the surfies don't want me in their club, right? Because we just don't click. And that's okay. I've gotten over that, right? I'm like, Lord, you didn't make me a surfie. But in heaven, I'm going to ask for a gift change, right? I'm going to be surfing on the river of life in heaven, right? But God has created me, so you know what? I play squash because, surfies don't play squash, but, nerds play squash. And I can connect with people that play squash, and I can connect with people in my neighborhood, and I can connect with people that, guess what? I can and you can't. And you can mingle with people that you can't. And so the mission is really simple. This week, let me mingle with one new person. And that person may be open to the gospel, and that person may be not. But how will I know? I won't know until I mingle. Every week, every month, our mission is to mingle with the people that God has uniquely created us to be able to mingle with. And as we mingle, as you talk to people, you know what you'll discover? The more... Tony said I can go till 2:30, so, I promise we won't finish by 2:30. You can blame Tony after this. I have met people. We lived in a place where we'd go, and my wife was running a small online business, and we would go to the post office about 300 meters from where we lived. And we met the post office owner, and he drove a $300,000 Porsche. He had multiple businesses, and every time we went, we had the intentionality of mingling with the people that we meet. And so first time he was like, hey, how you doing? Second time was like, do you run the place? Yeah. And every meeting, every time we'd drop something off, we'd have a 10, 20-second conversation. Learn his name, learned his family's, his wife's name, his son's name. And then after a couple of months, we said, hey, would you like to come over for a meal? And he was like, I would love to. And we got to know more about him. And he had lots of family and lots of friends and lots of money. And guess what? Without Jesus, empty. We were able to mingle and spend time with him. And as we were talking over meals before we moved out of the area, he said, we've got it all, but something's still missing. And we want what you have. That's what mingling does. As you mingle, people talk to you. That's what you do when you mingle. Look for opportunities to eat together. Invite them over. Some people say, I can't have anybody over for a meal. I don't know how to cook. Well, we're in Australia. Toast and Marmite. Right? Nobody cares what you give them for lunch. They care that you've invited them over for lunch. right? Keep it simple. Take them to a cafe and, shout them toast and Marmite there if you don't know how to do that. But we could do an afternoon workship on toast and Marmite if you want, if anyone's really interested. But look for opportunities to mingle. And then as we mingle, people share and they talk and they open. You don't have to, some people think, oh, I'm looking for the opportunity. When can I tell them about the mark of the beast? When there's time. You don't have to stress. When you mingle, they will ask, why do you do this? Why do you behave like that? If they're open and if they're ready, God will open a door for a conversation where you can share the hope and the faith that you have. It doesn't have to be forced. It doesn't have to be awkward. It doesn't have to be like, oh, did I miss my chance? And you go, I could have inserted it there, I missed talking about the 7 trumpets when he said he played the trumpet, You don't have to stress like that. This is God's work. The Spirit is moving, but our job is to mingle. And if the friends that I have aren't open yet, they will be tomorrow. When cancer hits, when divorce hits, when depression, they'll be open then, don't stress. But if the current group I'm mingling with aren't asking questions and the Spirit's not moving, guess what I can do? Well, there's only 27 million people in Australia. And that's great news. That means I can find some others to mingle with. And as we mingle, we can show them sympathy, which is what Jesus did, because people will share the joys and the journeys and the struggles in their life. And he's showed his sympathy to them. He ministered to their needs. He won their confidence. Then he bade them follow me. And you and I have the privilege and the opportunity to do that. And that's not the pastor's job. The pastor's job is to train and equip and mature us, to teach us how to read our Bibles, how to pray, how to have the basics of faith, and how to do this. And once a pastor has done that for you and I, once a pastor has taught me that when I am in trouble, where do I go to for help? Upstairs, on my knees and upstairs. So when I've learned that I can turn to God, that's a sign of maturity. When I've learned how to read my Bible every day, guess what? That's a sign of maturity. When I've learned how to come here and be part of the body of Christ and cook a meal for someone in need and pray together and sing songs and embrace each other and socialize together, guess what? That's a sign of maturity, right? When I've learned how to mingle with others and how to give a basic Bible study, which isn't hard to do. There are so many resources out there. You just got to read the thing. You don't have to invent anything new. When I've learned how to do that, guess what? I'm pretty mature. What more can a pastor do for me? Solve my conflicts. Because we cannot agree on the color of the carpet. No, get together, pray, and if you can't decide, just do rock or paper scissors, right? Because when Jesus comes back, he's not going to really care about the color of the carpet or how soft the pews are or that sort of thing. So when we've learned how to do those basics, we can free up the pastor, the evangelist, the prophet, the teacher, and let them go to the next place. Let them do social media, let them do radio, let them knock on doors, let them serve here, let them knock there, let them do other things, and it will allow them to operate in what God has called them to do, and it will allow us to operate in what God has called us to do. We're going to finish with one last verse, and then we'll wrap it up. 2 Corinthians chapter 5, and we're going to read verse 14 to 15 there. 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 14. This reminds us of why we do anything. And I want to stress and emphasize this point. We never do things out of coercion, out of fear, out of guilt. How long does guilt last? When you make someone feel guilty, how long does that impact last? Maybe a day, 2, 3. And eventually the guilt wears off and you've got to make them feel guilty again. Right? It doesn't last very long. Verse 14, for Christ's love compels us, because we are convinced that one died for all, and therefore all died. And he died for all, that those who live should no longer live for themselves, but for him who died for them and was raised again. Why do we do the things we do? Why do we say, Lord, how have you gifted me? How do I mingle? How do I share? How do I be a light in darkness? Because we've encountered Jesus. If you haven't encountered Jesus, guess what? That's okay. Because all of us started in darkness. All of us. And if you're not sure, why would I share something that doesn't sound so good? Talk to one of the mature members. Talk to an elder, talk to a pastor who can build you up and introduce you to Jesus and take you on that journey. And when you do encounter Jesus, his love compels us. And when his love compels us, we switch from becoming a virus to becoming a protein. What does a virus do? Who does a virus live for? A virus lives for themselves. And when a virus lives for themselves, what do they end up doing to those around them? It actually destroys. How many of you have really selfish friends? Selfish people don't have friends, right? Because they burn bridges and they hurt people and people keep a distance. And ultimately, a virus destroys everyone around them, burns all their bridges, and when a virus is left on its own, what happens to a virus? It dies. And Jesus came to save us from self-destruction, from destroying the people around us, our communities, and ourselves. And He's come to redeem us, to create us anew, to be part of His body, where every part, every finger, every molecule, every protein, every enzyme works together, not in competition, not in inferiority, superiority, not in hierarchy, but together, each unique, each distinct, each essential, and together we serve Him, and the body grows, and hope and light and joy and eternity is brought to those around us. So my question for you is, have you encountered Jesus? If you haven't, talk to myself, talk to the pastor, talk to one of the mature Christians here. They can take you on a journey to meet Jesus. And if you have, how has He gifted you? How has He called you? How has He uniquely created and shaped you? Because He has. He says so. I'm not saying that. He says, I've gifted you, I've called you, I've shaped you perfectly just to connect and to reach and to minister and to serve in a particular way, to bring life and hope and restoration to others so that they too can experience eternity. You've been created unique, you've been gifted, and you've been called. Experience the joy in living that out.